Shall we start? Peter, what do you think?
Yeah. Va bene.
Va bene. Allora, buongiorno a tutti e benvenuti. Welcome everybody to our event online in celebration of Dante Alighieri. As you know, March 25th is the National Day dedicated to Dante Alighieri. And if you don't know why it's the 25th of March, the date of the celebration, we normally say that it's the day that marks the beginning of the journey into the afterlife of the Divine Comedy. So this year it's a special celebration because it's 700 years since the death of Dante. So everywhere in the world, in Italy, but not only in Italy, there's like a big celebration and there's a lot of events going on during the day of the 25th of March, but also probably they're gonna last along like the whole year. And this is something which makes us think about the greatness of the poetry of Dante. The great Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges said that the comedy is a book that we must all read. And obviously we agree with that. We cannot live without Dante and his poetry. And that's a fact. And we're here today with Peter Anderson, Associate Professor of Department of English Literary Study at UCT, to celebrate 700 years of Dante Alighieri. Peter Anderson has degrees from Oxford and UCT in history and English. And poetry is, I think, one of his main interests.
Davvero.
Davvero.
Davvero, davvero.
And not only probably as a researcher, but probably also as a passion. So I think that today Professor Anderson will tell us about humanism and humanity in Dante. I just want to thank you, Peter, for being with us today. And I leave now, let's say the floor. I don't know if it's right, the floor.
We're sitting on the floor.
Yeah, to Professor Anderson, and I'll see you later for maybe a moment after the lecture for a moment of Q&A, if there's somebody who wants to make comments or questions. Thank you, and I'll see you later.
Grazie, Simo. Grazie. Borges is right. Dante is an author in especially the Commedia, but perhaps also in La Vita Nuova, whom we must all read. But I've got to start out with a confession, which is to say that, like many academics, I haven't read Dante the proper way, which is to start in the middle of life's journey and finding myself in a dark wood and end up, whatever, looking at the stars and the sun, whatever, after having gazed on the face of God and finding no words to describe it as Dante does it. I haven't, in other words, read the book sequentially from the beginning of the Inferno to the end of the Paradiso. Instead, I've read sections and chunks and gone back and then tried to read bits sequentially and so on. And over time, I think, and over time writing about Dante in particular, which requires a kind of a deep scrutiny of the book, whatever, I've read the text more or less. I think I find it difficult now to find a page on which I don't recognize myself as having read it. That speaks, I think, partly to the fact that it is a very long text. Those of you who study Italian here at Dante Alighieri will know that in the small open upstairs little classroom, there is a wonderful poster, which is the entire Commedia shrunk down to a kind of graphic representation of these tiny, tiny little cantos or whatever. And you look at it and you think, oh, I could read that. What if I was just standing here waiting for the lesson to start? I always find that very encouraging. But on the other hand, when I pick up my Dante, it's a chunky book or whatever, full, as you can see, of notes and so on and so forth. It's not an easy text to get to grips with in many ways, partly because it's 700 and something years old. And it reflects a worldview which is very, very pronouncedly different from ours. And it talks very, very definitely about a people and a kind of assemblage of people and a politics in between people or whatever that is deeply remote to us. We no longer can really remember whether the white and black factions belong to the Guelphs or the Ghibellines, and whether the Guelphs were for the papacy or the Ghibellines were for the papacy or the Ghibellines were for the empire. And it's all very confusing and troublesome. But I think that with all truly great writers, and T.S. Eliot said rather cheekily that they were just two, Dante and Shakespeare, and that between them, he said, they divide the world. With all these truly great writers, there's an inevitable tendency to see them as what I would call epochal. That is to say that they occur at a crisis juncture in society, straddling a kind of a before and an after. And in some degree, it's their good fortune, I think, to arrive at a certain point in history when the old order is giving way to the new order. And in their writing, they represent that moment, and they go down into, as it were, posterity and time immemorial as capturing for us that particular moment of human significance. On the other hand, I think sometimes their writing punctuates the flow of human history in such a way as for us to say, there is a change taking place in the consciousness of a single individual that is beautifully expressed, and gives us, as it were, pause to think that maybe the old is giving way to the new. So in some degree, they're thrown up, Marxists would say, certainly, by the material conditions of their society, to be, as it were, merely the spindrift emanations of the great kind of tectonic changes in their society that they talk about. And that's true of Dante, and that's true of Shakespeare too. But on the other hand, when we read Dante or Shakespeare, we come across characters like Hamlet, like any number of the characters who provide the vast human circumstance of the commedia or whatever, and we look at it and we say, there's something in Dante about this character that belongs to the Middle Ages, and there's something in this character that belongs to the future that we occupy, okay, and that is now our present, and that we consider in some unhappy, insecure way as, let's call it, modernity, okay? A world in which individual agency is important, a world in which history is no longer, as it were, brokered by an all-seeing God of the Alpha and the Omega, an ordained theocratic kind of providential history, but rather a history fashioned by human individuals in their undertakings in society. In this view of Dante as an epochal kind of writer, Dante is often seen as the great summation of the Middle Ages. He is the voice which comes at the end of the Middle Ages and really recapitulates for us most beautifully and most pertinently what the Middle Ages thought of the world, what the Middle Ages thought of human history, how they thought of God or whatever, and how they confronted certain problems in their philosophy that were as yet unresolved and which modernity needed, as it were, to succeed the Middle Ages in order to resolve. And I use the word summation very deliberately in this case, because in the Commedia, Dante follows very closely so much the summa, from which we get the Latin word, okay, from which we get from the figure of Thomas Aquinas, who's the great, more or less contemporary philosopher of Dante's time. He died when Dante was about 10 years old, and whom Dante follows very closely in particularly the theological ramblings of the final section, the Paradiso, of his grand construct. And I'm going to talk a little bit about philosophy as we go on. But then there's also, and I think we need to bear this in mind with some sense of modern self-scrutiny, there's also abroad the view of Dante very much erroneously or dubiously, I think, put abroad by the occasion of the Risorgimento, and even more nastily by fascist nationalism in Italy, which anticipates in Dante a modern unified Italy, in giving it a single language and what is famously considered a cultural crown. And that particular Dante, I think, is one that we have to resist in every way possible. It's difficult for us to do so because Dante has become so culturally iconographic that the cultural extension work of the Italian government around the world, whatever calls itself the Società Dante Alighieri. We identify Dante profoundly with Italian national sensibility, whatever. But Dante did not himself live in a time when he shared exactly that sensibility at all. And we've got to remember that Italian history has some particularly nasty episodes or whatever, and actually a very recent nationalist history, whatever, one which postdates Dante, whatever, by 400 years or even 600 years, whatever. So it's a complicated kind of notion, but it's one that I want to bear in mind as a kind of a rider to my idea that Dante belongs to a modern humanist or modern sensibility of humanity. So my concern is neither with Dante as the summation of the Middle Ages, nor really with Dante as an anticipation of the political, social, and cultural modernity that we now occupy. I don't wholly mean to argue that Dante is a Renaissance figure, a humanist of a Renaissance order before his time, though in many ways his genius appears actually to be that. And we can consider Dante from certain points of view and in certain lights to actually anticipate that moment. And I think that is from a scholarly and a commonsensical point of view, quite a decent proposition. I'm not really going to be pushing at that idea very hard. But perhaps I would rather like to push back our idea of humanism itself. And to do so, we need to stop here and in plain terms, think a little bit about what we really mean by humanism. And it's pertinent to do so because in the world in which I work, the academic world, we're increasingly concerned to talk about ourselves as occupying a post-humanist posterity, by which we mean two things. One is a great disquiet that in invoking humanism as the central philosophy of modernity, we are always recapitulating the idea that modernity emanated from great cultural, social, and intellectual transitions in the European circumstance and were exported through the great beneficial projects of imperialism out to the colonies and into the global moment that we now exist in. And of course, living in South Africa in the moment that we call the decolonial moment, we're increasingly concerned about those kinds of narratives which prioritize the European engagement and say that European humanism, the centrality given to the human individual in fashioning his or her or their own agency in history and so on, is something that emanates from the European North. It's possibly true, as many Africanist scholars would argue, for example, many South American scholars would argue, that humanist type sensibilities or whatever preceded the European occasion or whatever in African and South American societies by many hundreds of years. That is something still open to scholarship, and we need to push back a little bit at that particular notion. But the other reason why we live in a post-humanist age and why we've got to think a little bit about what humanism is that, of course, we're living in the age of the global ecocide. The humanist optimism in individual human agency, in the brilliance of rationality, in the ability of humankind to use its intelligence to prosper its cause in the world and to make a better and better world for more and more people, has in fact led us to a circumstance which we call, broadly speaking, global warming or the ecological crisis of the moment, in which humankind might be causing the extinction of a sizable percentage of the species of animals and plants on this particular planet, and potentially ourselves too. So it may be that we have shot ourselves more than in the foot, okay, directly in the brain. And we live in a circumstance, in other words, where we've got to take care not just of the priority of human occasions and interests in the world as it goes forward, but suddenly we've got to turn our attention to thinking a little bit about the particular emphasis that is owed by us to other aspects of the creation all around us, whether they be sharks or turtles or the fynbos in Cape Town or whatever the case may be, which human beings have jeopardized to the point of extinction or whatever, and in so doing have brought themselves into a similar space of jeopardy. Humanism, broadly speaking, when we talk about it, is the shift away from the rather static and passive position that the human being was conceived as being constituted under in the old medieval theocratic worldview, where we were born on the land, we never left the land that we were born on, we were probably peasants, very few of us were aristocrats and able to move around. We died on that particular land and our children grew up on that particular land. We went to the same church, we were baptized there, we took our sacraments at Mass there, and we were buried there, and we moved in a very static kind of relationship or whatever to the world, in which by and large, our social station was one ordained by God, okay, and reinforced for us by the state in the feudal relations, okay, of our obligations to the barone that held the land that we lived on, or whatever the case may be. Humanism, in contrast or whatever, follows the pattern that we see particularly perhaps more in the later humanist figure of those two great massive writers that T.S. Eliot isolates in the person of William Shakespeare, where again and again Shakespeare throws into the center of the stage, whatever, a human being who is struggling with the problems of his, usually his, but sometimes her agency in the world, and is asking the question, am I to do what I do because God makes me do it? And that's an inevitability of God's ordained history, of which God, the Alpha and the Omega, knows both the beginning and the end. And I am simply an inevitable pawn in the outworking of history. Or am I able to take a choice by free will, okay, operating out of my conscience, which is actually going to change history in ways which God allows me to do as part of his grace in the creation of humankind? And that's a theological debate which explodes in the same time of the Renaissance, or whatever, in the contestation between the Catholic Church and the rising Protestant movement of the Reformation. And that hangs over, okay? It's not actually present in Dante, whatever, but we can find it pregnant in Dante in certain senses that I think we'll come to in due course. So, this Renaissance foregrounding of the human agency in social and historical occasions is something that I'm wanting to suggest is present, or rather pregnant, in Dante, that we find, if not born and alive and well and living in Dante, is nonetheless very present there, okay? And it works ultimately towards a common sense of humanity. And I'm thinking that that common sense of humanity, as opposed to humanism, okay, there's a difference between the ity suffix and the ism suffix. That common sense of our humanity might be present, if we look at Dante, more obviously in medieval thinking than we tend to think it was. In English culture, the same could be said of Chaucer, who is a rough contemporary of Dante, and like Dante and like Boccaccio, an equal contemporary, is acutely preoccupied with human glory and human folly and the things of the world with which humans must deal, whether they be politics or chamber pots and sewage, and in the case of Chaucer, dirty stories, in the case of Boccaccio, dirty stories, and so on and so forth. That context of a very human world, or whatever, is present in medieval thinking. And when we look back to the great classics, okay, of late medieval thinking, whatever, we tend to import or export or transport and transpose our modern sensibility in such a way as to find a particular delight in Dante and Boccaccio and Chaucer, because in that late medieval thinking, we find our humanity, as we recapitulate it perhaps in the more ideological concepts of humanism, or whatever, actually anticipated and working towards the kind of people we find ourselves psychologically to be in the present moment, or more or less in the present moment, because we live also in an age of great disquiet in the post-humanist moment, as I've suggested should be the case. So my thesis really is simply that Dante is not just a brilliant exponent of the Aquinan medieval theological summa, okay, to use very academic terms. He's not just this brilliant exponent of what the medieval philosophical attitude to history and human politics and the human soul in its outworkings was all about. He does do that, there's no doubt about it, and he does do that in the main. That's his dominant subject, absolutely. Nor is he entirely a Renaissance agent. It's not as though he's stepped 100 or 150 years forward into the age of Shakespeare, or whatever, of rising mercantile capitalism, and is somebody who is eschewing the orthodoxies of the Catholic Church and preferring Protestant one-on-one relationships with God, or whatever, increasingly concerned with a vision of history in which individuals build agency, or whatever, and have a say given to them by grace, through God, or whatever, by grace, or whatever, and are able to, as it were, fashion a human history outside of the inevitabilities of the theocratic kind of organized religious presumptions of history, or whatever, that pertained in the Middle Ages. Even though Dante's whole life, and I think this is important, was loosened, is the word I'd like to use. Even though Dante's whole life was loosened by the much more rapid and fluid social relations of a more, for us, recognizable individualistic kind of subjectivity in the coming city-states of Italy, rather than those very static social relations I've described, which pertained in the rural, feudal, baronial kind of Europe that lay really all around those precocious Italian city-states, those ducal states, those early republics in some instances or whatever, controlled by powerful families, often following similar contours of power, but very much anticipating a politics that's much more hustling and bustling and more akin to the politics that we know, and which absolutely fills the Commedia as part of its great glory as a work of art. So instead, what I'm arguing really is that Dante, instead of being simply a humanist, or a summation of the Middle Ages, one or the other of the two sides of the epochal moment he straddles, I want to argue that he is simply very human, and that he is a poet of our humanity, and that is really the true glory, not just of his great poem, but of his intellectual contributions in De Vulgari Eloquentia and in La Vita Nuova, and so on and so forth, other works of his which are less read or whatever, but equally important academically and equally beautiful in the case of La Vita Nuova too. So let's give you some statistics or whatever, which can kind of lean on my particular case. The scholars compute that Dante deals with over 600 individual people in his great poem, which is an enormous number of people to be named. 600 actual people. It's more people than most people actually would recognize as names if they were to scroll through the friends list on their Facebook account. I think the psychologists say we normally know about 140 of them actually. Dante manages to bring in 600 of them, 250 of them from classical antiquity, which he knew probably thoroughly well or whatever, and also anticipates a Renaissance way of thinking. 80 of them biblical, which would have been known by all and sundry, because the Bible, of course, would have been read out in church every Sunday. 180 more or less contemporary Italians, okay, for whom Dante frequently reserves the most vicious and bitchy of his kind of punishments in hell, and about 90 contemporary foreigners, which suggests that Dante's political imagination was not just historically grounded in Italy, but was also geographically extensive over the Europe that he knew about. He was simply a prodigious mind as well as a brilliant poet. He's able to marshal this extraordinary detail about humanity. And I think that in simple statistical terms, the numbers that I'm leaning on there is more than enough to make my case. This is not solely a poem of theological abstraction, okay, but a bustling polity of the dead who precede us all. And in every case, Dante isolates human values or follies or failings to which we can relate. In all those 600 cases, okay, a certain allegorical significance is tracked and traced by Dante or whatever in terms of that particular individual's significance to the vision that Dante has of the way in which God wants to sort the world out, or to sort us out or whatever into the sheep and the goats, okay, of his creation. Moreover, when Dante deals with these 600 people, he does so in ways that displays his own humanity to a particular degree. For example, as I've suggested, he overwhelmingly condemns, this is an even more precise kind of focus, he overwhelmingly condemns his in-laws, the Donati, or whatever, to the agonies of hell. He's absolutely awful about his in-laws, which is a very human kind of position to adopt. Many of us find our in-laws very difficult, okay? I happen to find mine very lovely. But many find them extremely difficult, and it's a human impulse which we find in Dante and which we recognize, okay, as it were leaping over the border of the Middle Ages into modernity. It is a common human concern. Yet, strangely, he never once mentions his own wife in the poem that rises literally to a realm in which Dante is guided ultimately by a girl he fell in love with as a boy of 9 years old when she was a girl of 9, okay? And then again in a vision, re-encountering her aged about 18 or whatever. So this whole poem, okay, in which he viciously distributes these contemptuous punishments upon the Donati, doesn't actually mention the Donati to whom he's married at all, but instead elevates the 9-year-old girl, okay, who staggered into his life in a colpa di fulmine, okay, in a kind of crisis moment or whatever, of the occasion of blinding love, or something approximating to that, which I want to talk about a little bit now, whatever, okay, and he concerns himself with that. That to us is also a modern kind of mode of sensibility, or whatever, a kind of ability to acknowledge, or whatever, that there may be a different kind of love that's entailed, all right, in the relations that you have with your in-laws and your wife, and the kind of love that is revealed to you in a vision when you first, as it were, make contact with somebody of the attractive sex, whichever that is for you, in Dante's case, the opposite sex, in the case of Beatrice Portinari. These are in every way human elements in Dante himself, and they loom over and they seep through the poem in its entirety. Let's be clear, as I've said before, that Dante's history throughout the Commedia is a providential, theocratic history ordained by a God, the order of a God who is, as I keep saying, the Alpha and the Omega, who knows the beginning and the ends of human circumstances and straddles them all, or whatever. But Dante's interaction with human psychology in this, or whatever, was slightly different. In the introduction by David Higgins to this, which is my preferred translation of Dante by C.H. Sisson or whatever, David Higgins makes an extraordinarily interesting little side point, which I'm going to mention with you here. He talks about a moment in the eighth circle of hell, when Dante starts listening to two of the condemned in that particular circle of hell, arguing pettily, kvetching at each other about nonsense, and it's unimportant for our present purposes to go into that, or whatever. And Dante says, or whatever, that in order to hear them, I had stood stock still when my master, he's turning to Virgil at this stage, said to me, "You are still looking, a little longer and I shall quarrel with you." And Dante, suddenly awakened from this enchantment, or whatever, says, when I turned to him speaking to me in anger, when I heard him, speaking to me in anger, I turned towards him and was so ashamed that I am so still when I think of it. What Dante seems to me, and this is crucially important to be confessing to in that moment, is an inclination to listen to the vicissitudes and details of human conflict, the arguments of two arbitrary condemned people in the eighth circle of hell, the fraudsters or whatever, which fascinates him because there's something in Dante which believes, even though it is not the doctrinal orthodoxy of the providential history, that he overlays the entire, as it were, template, the structural architecture of his thinking and philosophy in the Commedia, which he nonetheless believes is really sneakily his suspicion as to how humankind really works. Little arguments between people are what drive history forward. These arguments are random and small and petty, but they're human and they make the difference, okay? And they go on making the difference even in the circles of hell, despite God's ordained plan. So there's a tension between this providential ordained history that God, the Alpha and the Omega, straddles or whatever, and the actual interest that Dante keeps having or whatever in these peculiarly minute little human moments all along the way. Dante was a politician, dramatically so, deeply involved in the politics of his Florence of his time. He was an ambassador, he was an exile in consequence of his politics, he was a soldier, we forget that. He was a linguist, okay, a very good one able to invent, to all intents and purposes, a language out of the dialects of his moment. He was a friend of Giotto, the painter, or whatever. He was in the common concourse of the culture of his moment. He was, above all, for our present purposes, a poet. He was, in other words, a devout Catholic, a father, a husband. He was a lover of other women. We know that too, whatever. Some even speculate that he had homosexual leanings. But in every way we want to think of him, he was fundamentally a human being. And yet his whole life was oriented by the encounter that he had as a prepubescent 9-year-old and then as an adolescent 18-year-old with the figure of Bice or Beatrice Portinari as the star by which he eventually sailed and whom he uses as the ultimate guide when he gets to paradise, for most of paradise. Eventually St. Bernard has to take over. In Beatrice Portinari, he brought to the medieval ideal of womanhood that had been collated in the very static apprehension of the figure of the Madonna, the Virgin Mary, something that brings it down into human flesh and into the realm and mystery of human love as it is sometimes devastatingly affecting individuals, even the very young. And I think that Dante psychologically is particularly fascinated in the circumstances of his own heart. What is it about love or whatever that affects him as a 9-year-old boy when he first confronts Beatrice Portinari or whatever at an event, too young to be sexually interested in her, too young to be romantically interested in her, too young to have read the texts that Paula and Francesca have read or whatever, those who've blown around in the second circle of hell or whatever, the great medieval kind of love allegories and so on. He doesn't have that kind of cultural background about romantic love, and yet something seizes him, this colpa di fulmine or whatever, and he guides his entire intellectual star, his entire concept of faith and grace and the beauty of God or whatever, by this particular encounter. And yet it is a human mystery. It's got to do with a human 9-year-old child, or 2 human 9-year-old children, and 2 human 18-year-old teenagers, and their brief and momentary encounters. This, as it sometimes devastatingly affects the young, okay, as I suggest, to feel so acutely, okay, but to be nonetheless incapable personally and socially of doing anything about it is a human dimension. And I think that a great many of us find the vast sort of theological summations and the abstractions of the very beautiful third section of the Commedia, the Excursus in Paradise, whatever, simply accessible because of this great love that exists between Dante and Beatrice. And it remains all the way through, or whatever, a strange truth, or whatever, that this poem is in some degree also a love homage, or whatever, from a 9-year-old boy to a 9-year-old girl. That is something extraordinarily different. The critic Jacob Burckhardt said, and I think this sums up exactly all I want to say about the matter, that the human spirit in this instance, the human spirit had taken a mighty step towards the consciousness of its own secret life. And that is a radical statement. It's an absolutely radical statement because it is a break in its entirety with the medieval way of thinking about the world, that we have a secret life, secret even as it were from God. It is to anticipate the romantic movement of the 18th and 19th century across Europe, okay, which still suffuses our popular culture if we turn on KFM and listen to the Goehe Treffers of romantic love and so on and so forth. It is to anticipate Darwin, and through Darwin it's to anticipate Freud and all our encounters with our therapists and our invocation of things like self-care, our idea of true love, the idea that there is the one for us, all these kinds of ideas, our whole personal, rather than the priorly medieval social conception of marriage or of love, in the romantic sense at least. In many ways, this is what Plato thought of about love, whatever, and Dante is coming to it without any explicit knowledge of Plato, whatever, and in that way he anticipates much of the Renaissance humanist moment, whatever, but he does it out of love for a 9-year-old girl, rather than out of any particular intellectual argumentation. Now, I'm going to conclude just by mentioning briefly 2 other aspects of the Commedia, which seem to me peculiarly prescient of our modern moment. The first is Dante's attitude to philosophy itself. Philosophy is a dangerous undertaking to the medieval mind because, to all intents and purposes, inquiry into the circumstances of knowledge or whatever is to tread rather dangerously on the toes of the godly prerogative. After all, it is our duty really to obey God's knowledge of what is due us in this particular world, rather than to seek to inquire, okay, as to why things should be the way they are. The simple answer is God intends them to be the way they are, and it's your duty to go about obeying that intention in your life. Dante, nonetheless, is deeply philosophically underwritten and subscribed. He knows his philosophy, primarily, as I've suggested, through the figure of Thomas Aquinas, whom he holds in great respect and reverence all the way through. Okay, and he seems in La Vita Nuova to at one point suggest that he turns briefly after the death of Beatrice Portinari, to what he calls la donna gentile, okay? The kind woman, this other woman figure in his life. And we've wondered, scholars, for a long time, whether there was another woman in the story, or whether he's in fact using this donna gentile as a metaphor for philosophy itself, a kind of consolation that he is able to turn to in the crisis of Beatrice's death. The legacy of the so-called 12th century Renaissance, the throwing up of the great Renaissance cathedrals of Europe, or whatever, whether in Vercelli in northern Italy, or in Paris in Notre Dame, or in Durham in England, and so on and so forth, culminates ultimately in Aquinas's Summa. And it's informed also, and I think this is important for us to state in our decolonial moment, profoundly by the donation of Arab thinking, which brings a great deal of Aristotle and so on and so forth back into European concourse of thought and so on. All of this Dante is aware of, okay? And this emphasis that he shares in on the beauty and grace of human inquiry into the human and the humane pushes back, I think, our temporal concept of humanism by a century or two. And it reminds us that we need perhaps to be dating the Renaissance less on European precepts, whatever, than perhaps on Arab precepts of the recovery of Aristotle to human sensibility and so on and so forth. That even the Middle Ages, in the person of Aquinas and in the person of Dante at one remove, whatever, were engaged into inquiries into what it was that was making the world tick, which is implicitly to say, is there something beyond God, or a rearticulation of our idea of God, which we need to have in order to properly understand why things are the way they are in the cosmos and in our hearts when we confront a beautiful 9-year-old girl at a dinner party at our parents' house. And then the last thing I want to consider just in passing is the delightful problematic of language itself. There is, that there be, I suppose, in Dante, a kind of argument that there be a human agency in the constitution of a language to reconcile the Babel of the dialects of Italy at the time. Dante makes that his explicit project, whatever. He makes it, albeit in Latin, whatever, in De Vulgare Eloquentia, whatever, an argument for that particular case, and then he enacts that particular argument by fusing the Italian dialects around him, whatever, with a heavy emphasis on his Tuscan dialect and a great deal of scholarly knowledge of Latin, into what we now conceive of as the first great text and the summatory great text, or whatever, of what is recognizably, putatively modern Italian, or the launching point of all of that. This is in itself, I'm arguing, indicative. It underwrites in very important ways also the kind of lesion, this septic sore of internecine warfare, which is so much part of Dante's philosophical and cultural and social occasion. This conflict between Guelph and Ghibelline, between different city-states, even between families across political divides. And in Dante's hands, all this is to argue that language, to the praise of God, as he intends it to be in the Divine Comedy, arises out of human evolution and use, and is not only to be found in the donation of the orthodoxy, okay, of the theocratic agency of the church in its use of the static and ossified form of Latin. Dante looks around himself, whatever, and says it is possible for humankind to correct the error of disunity begun in the parable of the Tower of Babel or whatever, and to bring languages together towards one another, and people in different languages together and towards one another in the summation of the linguistic accomplishment of a common tongue. In this, the Divine Comedy is not a parable of the Tower of Babel, but a parable of Pentecost. It is not a story of people speaking in tongues, okay, as evangelical Christians frequently mistake the miracle of Pentecost, but of people hearing different tongues and each understanding them in their own. That is the donation which Dante puts before us. And for those of us who come to study Italian as English speakers, as I am, and make a royal mess of it, but strive again and again to do so in order that one day we might be able to read Dante in the original, we are doing so because we are inheritors of Dante's linguistic optimism. And it's on that optimistic note that I'm going to conclude and hope you have some questions for me.
wow, I'm always fascinated by Peter's ability to lead us through poetry as an intimate journey, and to discover aspects that we probably didn't notice or grasp in a way. And so I'm fascinated by all the aspects that actually Peter highlighted. Dante's humanity, Dante as a man of his times, but not only of his times, also a universal man, like with all the I don't know, flows or all the different emotions besides believing in God and believing in destiny or a higher scheme, let's say, but also with our free will and our petty aspects of humanity, which is quite interesting and which is actually making Dante still so modern and actual very close to us. So I don't know if there's any comments or questions or I don't know if you want to communicate something to Peter or to us in some way, just let us know. I'm gonna check now. Vicky Betta says, la ringrazio tanto, very informative. I have some ready to do now, hopefully in Italian in the future, yes.
Vicky, anch'io.
And just for your also, I remind you that we have actually recorded the lecture, and it will be available on our YouTube channel. If you follow us also, you can check probably on the website or on our media. I don't know, any comments? Okay, Simona, Simona, I see there's a hand raised.
Simona, why don't you unmute yourself and just ask?
Yeah, shall I unmute?
I'm trying. Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yes.
Hi.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me now? Okay. Yes, I have a question. I recently listened to Barbero, this historian that in Italy is now a big star, saying that Dante put in hell all his enemies in real political life. And so it was very arbitrary in that choice. What do you think about that?
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. I think the inferno, the various circles of hell are filled with the enemies of Dante. Once again, in a way which, as Simo put it, or whatever, show up the extraordinary psychological flaw in Dante himself, or whatever. Dante should stand accused of a kind of very nasty vengeance that he takes on a great many people, or whatever. Clearly incensed by and brokenhearted by his exile from Florence. He's incapable in many instances of much in the way of gracious forgiveness there, or whatever. And he sort of subsumes, and I think this is an interesting, slightly humanist kind of point in Dante too. He sort of subsumes the prerogative of God to do the punishing and condemning. It's quite a blasphemous undertaking that he does in the Commedia. He says, I will play God, and I will decide that you are to blow around like windy starlings in the sky forever because you are incontinent lovers. Or I will turn you into a weird phallic lizard monster, horrible thing, whatever, because you're part of my wife's family that I don't particularly like, and so on, which is an extraordinary position to adopt. And, from our point of view, still, if we have a theological inclination, a rather dangerous one. But I think that that's very well observed, and it points up Dante's fallibility and his humanity, given that humanity is constituted in part of our fallibility. So I think that's very true. Of course, it makes the Inferno perhaps the most interesting of the books of the Commedia, where the Purgatorio is often the most lyrically poetic, whatever, as he balances individuals who are good individuals who've erred and wobbled in minor ways, whatever. He has really rather beautiful encounters with them. And then there's this kind of blazing light of philosophy and this frequent inability to actually describe what he's seeing. Words fail me, he keeps saying, words fail me, when he reaches kind of these sort of different story. But Inferno is, we quite like it because it's like a Hollywood B movie. It blows away his enemies, and it's peculiarly fallible and human. Yes, very good point.
Well, thank you. It's not my point. It's actually Barbero's point. My point was another. If nobody else is asking questions, I would like to put a second one. Is that okay?
Yeah, I think it's fine. I don't see anybody really like queue, so I think you can go on with this.
Okay, all right then. When I was at school, I detested Dante because of all the notes and the commentaries. So I reached an agreement with my Italian literature teacher that I would study Dante, but I would not study all these comments. I would make my own comments because my young arrogance, I claimed that, well, these comments, they're not real. Everybody's just coming up with an opinion, and my opinion is as good as theirs. So my question is, how accurate do you think is the commentary to Dante?
I think
that we study school.
I couldn't relate more closely to an attitude than yours. I think Dante is mired in commentary. I think that the way in which we try and search out the historical detail of each circumstance, whatever, is of course of the greatest academic interest, and it has a certain purport. It may illuminate things for certain types of mind that like a logical and full explanation, but it is always to the exclusion, or at least the relegation, of the beauty of the poetry itself. And we forget that Dante is an extremely musical master in the way in which he produces his terza rima or whatever. I think of no better representation of that particular truth than by encouraging those of you who haven't to go onto YouTube and to find an oration of Dante by Benigni, which is, whether one has the Italian or not, an absolutely heart-stirring kind of occasion. It is the poetry that counts, or whatever, and nobody in the audience is sitting with a set of glosses as to exactly who whatever the person is, Gilberto Donati, or whatever the story may be, whatever. They're simply sitting there listening to the poetry as it washes over them. This is fundamentally, first and foremost, a poem. It is only secondarily a text of retributions in late medieval Florence and the kind of complex outworkings of the factionalisms around the Guelphs and the Ghibellines and stuff. And the poem can get absolutely mired and lost in those kind of philological inquiries. And my sympathies are with you entirely. They happen to suit me because my Italian is really at the musical rather than at the intelligible phase in my own life. And I salute that opinion totally.
That's also, I think it's quite interesting because we also find that when we read Dante, Dante's poem is like, it's something that you can read aloud, and even if you really don't understand every single word or the entire meaning of a phrase, it still resonates, and it's something that we need to recognize in a way. I think that's what actually makes the commedia something so exceptional.
Agreed.
I thank you very much, both of you. And well, I'm gonna stay online if there are other questions, and I say goodbye to you in any case.
Grazie, Simona.
Grazie,
thank
ciao.
you. Ciao.
Okay.
Okay, there's somebody says Aileen French says, so glad there is a recording, fascinating lecture, especially the different ways of thinking about Dante and the language. Sorry, we have some noise. I have been struggling to improve my Italian for years. Would love to read the original Commedia.
Me too, me too.
So, but we can just say, just try, probably. I mean, from my point of view, when I start to learn the English and I study English literature, I was trying to read like English poetry. And sometimes it's really it's a good exercise also to just approach poem like that, like reading and try to.
What is true, I find, is that if you can find a joint translation, in other words, a translation of the Commedia, which has a facing page translation in English, it's quite consoling as a learner of Italian to read the line of Italian, not understand it, read the line of English, go back to the line of Italian and realize you did understand it better than you thought you were. You've come further along than you know, despite the fact that the Italian is, of course, good Lord, 700 and something years old, which is, you know, considerably older than Shakespearean English is. And my students at the University of Cape Town find Shakespearean English difficult enough to follow. It is a challenge, but in point of fact, whatever, it is actually with a gloss intelligible, and it's encouraging to give just a short passage, just one canto, for example, a slow reading, and to try out your translation facility, whatever, and you'll find that you can make some sense of it. It's consoling.
Okay, just remind you also that probably we have Roberto Benigni video in our video library, let's say. But I think, yeah, you can find it also on YouTube if you just want to have an example of what Peter was mentioning before. If there's any other question or comment, just let us know.
There's a Benigni link, thank you.
Yeah. We don't want to like, okay, I think that there's nobody else. We can also just end our appointment for today. I just want to give something to Peter, just to thank you. It's like a gift from our ministry of from MAE, and together with the Comune di Ravenna, it's audiolibro Dalla selva oscura al paradiso.
That's wonderful.
So
that's absolutely incredible.
You can actually...
Molto grazie.
We have other copies here if somebody wants to probably take
absolutely beautiful
and start to listen to it. And yeah, thank you everybody. Grazie a tutti, but obviously special thanks to Peter for being here with us and giving us this like opportunity to understand better some aspects of Dante Alighieri, and just follow us to check if you wanna see the recorded event, but also try to follow all there's a lot of events everywhere which are online regarding the DanteDì today, so maybe you find other aspects and other interesting lectures or events regarding Dante. And yeah, thank you very much. And probably...
Excuse me, there's a question about the name of the translator. Vicky Better has got a question in the column there.
Laura has put up the name of the translator, which is C.H. Sisson. It's there in the...
Oh, I see. Is that the... I see. Okay, thank you. Thank you. My apologies. My apologies.
It's simply called Dante the Divine Comedy. It happens to be a preferred text of mine, but...
I'll show you.
There you go, yeah. I'm not even sure to what extent it's still in print or not. There are many English translations and many of them are very good. There's a wonderful one from the 19th century by Francis Carey, C-A-R-Y. And that's extremely accessible as well, and did a great deal to put Dante on the intellectual map of the English-speaking world. So there's that one too, C-A-R-Y, Francis Carey. But Look, any translation will do. Dante's poetry shines through. There may be better or worse translations or whatever, but there is no greater poem, so it works.
Thank you. Anybody else? Mara. Okay. Okay, so I think it's fine for today. Thank you everybody. Grazie a tutti per essere stati con noi. We would like to organize more like appointments like that. Maybe also some of you just asking us to organize something in Italian. We're gonna do that maybe on some other subject, and just follow us and let's see. Grazie e buona giornata. Buon DanteDì.
Buona giornata a tutti.
Ciao.
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 Ciao.